yeoman's work for our team to make sure that we hit everything as accurately as we could possibly make. Our team itself made up of this group that's shown on the screen. Can everybody in the audience see the screen fine? Right? Up here? Yes, good. So it's a real strong team with a lot of talent. You can see the focus areas where each of them were spending time on, but it's a good team of specialists that committed a lot of time to this project. Jennifer and Laura will also be presenting with me today to talk about their particular parts of the project. Some ground rules that we want to cover is that there's a lot of material that we're going to share. It's really an overview of the first 100 or so pages of the report. We'll definitely give time at the end for questions, but we'd like to be able to walk through the presentation with you. A couple of notes is that the slide number in the lower right-hand corner, if there's a slide that you want to ask questions or talk about at the end, it would help us if you identify that slide number if you need us to go back to that slide. And each slide that we go through has a page number in the draft report that was published that you can also reference if you have questions related to that. The report available online is considered a draft. Even since it's been published, we've had a couple of good suggestions and changes that we'll reflect tonight, either errors in some of the data or questions that needed to be reviewed. We'll identify where we've made those changes already in the report itself. But we should be, it'll take us about 75 to 85 minutes to go through this portion of the report. The Countywide Fire Service Review, the actual laws, I'm going to turn over to Jennifer Stevenson, who should come up online.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm certain there are people in the audience that are aware of the service review requirements, but for the benefit of those that are joining us for the first time, I just wanted to go quickly through the purpose of a service review and what content is legally required to be contained within the report that you're reviewing. Government Code 56430 requires that LAFCOs conduct service reviews on special districts and cities to inform updates to each agency's sphere of influence. The Government Code also requires that LAFCOs review and update those spheres of influence, or SOIs, once every 5 years or as necessary. A sphere of influence is defined as an agency's probable ultimate growth boundary. The service review is used to determine where an appropriate sphere is for each agency based on the several required factors or determinations that are on the next slide. The Government Code does outline the required content for the service review, and service reviews are required to come to determinations on several factors that are outlined here, including growth and population projections, location and characteristics of disadvantaged unincorporated communities. The third one is quite big: present and planned capacity of public facilities, adequacy of public services, and infrastructure needs and deficiencies. There's also financial ability to provide services, the status of and opportunities for shared facilities. The aim of this determination is to get to the degree of and any opportunities for resource sharing. So we typically include other collaborative efforts and sharing practices beyond just the facilities portion. The next determination is accountability for community service needs and governmental structure and operational efficiencies. This one entails identifying governmental structure options that could enhance efficiencies of service, which is a priority of LAFCO. And finally, any other matter determined by LAFCO. These determinations are summarized at the end of each of the agency's respective chapters in the report. The purpose of the service review is, I have already mentioned, as I've mentioned, is to inform the sphere of influence update, but it can also be used for prompting discussion and consideration of potential jurisdictional boundary changes. as well as initiating any resulting desired changes and considering other types of LAFCO applications, that's by LAFCO, and providing an impetus or resource for further studies. And with that, I'll pass that back to you, Dan, for process and methodology.
Thanks, Jennifer. So the process and methodology, the LAFCO formed their TAC group, conducted some outreach, identified the criteria based on the law that was there. We held our kickoff meeting with AP Triton in August of 2022 and started with data discovery right after that kickoff meeting. The first agency started uploading their actual data within the first 2 to 3 weeks, but there was a lot of follow-up with data that needed to be filled in. We asked for a lot of information to be able to do this particular review. And it took really until early 2023 to get about 90% of the data, and some required follow-up well into 2023. I want to mention that the fire chiefs during this process were really inundated with data requests, starting first with the consultant that was chose that asked for a lot of information from the different fire chiefs. And then we came in and asked for some of the same information, but in a different way, which required them to go through that at the same time. And then third, the county is running a similar study and asking the fire chiefs again to produce data. So I think most of them would expect the responsibility to produce data for one report, but adding that all in the middle of their normal everyday workday, right through the budget process, all that was a fairly big impact on the fire chiefs. And we worked hard to make sure that they could get their time to make that work. And it did delay some of the project, but understandably so. The next part was when once we got the data, we started drafting the agency profiles. We started with those agencies who submitted the data first. This process was important. LAFCO got the first look, then the fire chief got the second look, and then cities and districts got that third look and review to try and get that accurate. And the back and forth took a lot of time. The first profile was done by late January. The last profile took up until the end of May with some back and forth. We really couldn't work through the full analysis until we saw the full profiles across the entire county. So that again was an important step, that people had a chance to review this before it became published, those portions. And our team needing to get all that data completed before we could do the actual public reviews of the profiles. Now we're into the community meetings like we are today. AP Triton will receive comments from LAFCO, so we need people to submit formal requests through LAFCO. We'll review those, we'll acknowledge the comments, we'll answer the question, and if appropriate, change parts of the report. Some of that we anticipate will be factual statements that relate to the profiles themselves. And then a red line version will be available that shows what's different between the report that was published and what report's being presented as a final draft. And then LAFCO will hold a hearing in August or August 2nd. And after that meeting, they'll receive the final draft and then later on the adoption. Some of the data limitations that we faced in this process, lack of standardization, some missing data, some erroneous data. Everyone has a unique CAD and RMS system, which complicated our process of trying to look at this in an apples to apples manner. We found 59 different data sources from 21 different systems. Very few data sets shared the same schema. Some struggled with exporting data in a friendly format that we could manage. Some field names were different between agencies. Some CAD systems in some agencies did not link with the RMS, so we couldn't reconcile the data points between those two areas, and RMS being a records management system that's managed inside the department. Some agencies even changed their CAD or their RMS records management system in the period that we were looking at for the data analysis. There were errors in some of the data provided, some duplicate records, incorrect mutual aid codes, geocodes times. Not really abnormal, other than the fact that there are so many disparate systems in the county. Our team spent a lot of time taking care of this to make sure that we could get a valid analysis. I do want to recognize that our team member Clay Stewart was really involved in stitching this together to try and get that comparison to work. A recommendation here boils down to asking the Santa Clara fire chiefs to maybe coordinate some data standardization among the fire agencies, promote a single CAD system for the county, and get access to each agency to review their data related to that CAD project. And all agencies should review the quality of inputs by their people. It's definitely not an issue strictly to Santa Clara County. There's a real move afoot to try and get more passive data entry. It's a lot to ask a firefighter who's in the middle of battling a house fire to actually make sure his data is completely accurate. The more passive we can enter the data in, the more accurate and consistent that we can find it. So that's one recommendation in the data side. Countywide overview, we'll kind of go through just the big picture parts of Santa Clara County as a whole. Service providers, there's 9 fire agencies. We did not include NASA Ames. They're not obligated to participate, and they didn't choose to participate in this project. AMR provides transport, except in Palo Alto, where they provide for their city and for Stanford. Fire has some local providers, but also provides service to the SRA. There's volunteer organizations. This slide talks about they're all operating in an area not provided by a local provider. That's not accurate. I made a mistake on that slide. 2 are operating in South County, 1 in Central. Spring Valley is operating in an area that's not receiving local fire protection. They're all doing the best they can for what they are charged with. Service providers, this slide just simply states that Gilroy is providing service to Gilroy. Milpitas and San Jose are providing to their city, but also to a zone 1 area that's unincorporated areas of Central Fire that are not really adjacent to Central Fire. So those are under contract with those entities. In here, Palo Alto also serves Stanford University. And then Central Fire, CCFD, has a number of cities and areas that they serve. This next slide shows an image of the community. I'm not expecting you all have seen this, but the outside border is the county boundaries. The cities are gray. The fire districts are the 4 solid colors. Los Altos Hills is purple. CCFD is tan. Saratoga is pink, and South County is green. The services provided inside Santa Clara County as a whole, all agencies responding to fires. 8 of the 9 provide an advanced life support, first response. Sunnyvale Fire and Police provide basic life support. Palo Alto provides primary ALS transport. Gilroy, Milpitas, Morgan Hill, San Jose, and Santa Clara City provide a backup ALS transport when AMR is busy. CCFD, Mountain View, and San Jose provide specialist level tech rescue and hazmat. In our report, it states Mountain View is at the operations level. They've indicated they are operating at the specialist level for tech rescue and hazmat. And all provide a level of fire prevention to their communities. The fire stations, there's 90 total fire stations in Santa Clara County, and 41 or 45.6% are older than 50 years. 50 have either no or unknown seismic protection, and 36 are rated in poor condition using a survey tool we provided, but they were self-assessed in what would define them as the different levels of condition. The number of stations with either no or unknown seismic protection and rated poor is concerning for our community here. The determinations for these agencies are addressing this issue is in their profile of the report if you were to go into the specific communities. Staffing on duty every day, there's 418 people, but there's 1,867.39 firefighters and civilian employees employed by fire departments in Santa Clara County. The 90 stations are staffed with 418 firefighters per day across the county, 16 battalion chiefs, 88 engines, 19 trucks, and 25 other units. San Jose staffs engines and trucks with 4, Santa Clara with with 3 and trucks with 4. Sunnyvale staffs engines and trucks with 2, but supplements their response with law. Everyone else staffs engines and trucks with 3. Incident volume and performance. I want to hit on a couple of key things here. The numbers showing are the annual call volume over the last 3 years averaged. The incidents per thousand is strictly a metric that indicates how many responses are going on based on the population. So like Milpitas is at 62 per thousand, Palo Alto's at 107. Strictly population isn't always a good measurement of how many calls and incidents are occurring. The 90th percentile measurement on the third column has to do with a standard measurement through the fire service that's for response time. So if there's 100 incidents, 90 are going to have a response time of X or better. So you take the 90th time, that time for that 90th call is the actual 90th percentile. It doesn't mean that there aren't a large number of incidents that fire departments are hitting much faster than that. Most of the time, 20 to 30% of the calls are in the 2 to 3 minute range. The 90th percentile is a target. And as of now, none of the fire agencies in Santa Clara County are meeting their adopted goal for response time. Unit utilization rate is another key indicator of how busy a crew is. This is strictly for emergency incidents. Firefighter crews come on in the day and they're generally busy from 8 to 5 and into the evening. It's on some days. They're training, they're doing inspections, they're doing maintenance, community events, important things. However, these events they can break away from and respond to an emergency incident. What we're most concerned about is when they're committed on another call and cannot break away on another incident. If they're tied up on a call and another incident comes in and a resource typically from a farther away area responds, and if they're unavailable in their area, their first due area being their station zone, more than 10%, it makes it very hard for them to meet a 90th percentile response. Most fire departments have adopted a standard. Some governing bodies have not adopted what the fire department has adopted. Milpitas and Morgan Hill do not have a standard adopted. And typically, and that's okay, but typically you look at NFPA 1710 as a standard. And that's typically a more stringent standard than what communities end up adopting. The next slide kind of shows the summary of where this sits. There's 156,000 incidents a year, averaging 74.2 incidents per thousand. The average of the fire agencies is 944 for the 90th percentile. That's not the average of all the calls. That's just the averages of the 9 agencies. And there's 33 units in the system that are exceeding 10% utilization. Gilroy has 1 unit that's exceeding that particular target in the South County area. Recommendations as we walk through emergency response performance. We're recommending that provide an opportunity for elected officials to adopt the response time goals that the fire department has identified. The report in there states that Mountain View has not adopted it, but we understand that the governing body has adopted that standard. We also are recommending to consider a baseline standard that defines the level of service for the community. And each agency would work on this recommendation individually with their governing bodies. Our next recommendation on unit utilization hours, any units exceeding the 10% unit hour utilization could use some help. Again, it's difficult to meet that 90th percentile goal. Palo Alto's resources are ambulances, which is different. The engines in the stations are actually meeting or below 10%. Our next recommendation relates to boundary drop response. And this is an area where the South County is doing extraordinarily well. Respond the closest unit, regardless of jurisdiction, for critical calls. The part that we want to promote also is using the actual location. So using an AVL dispatch system would be helpful. The service here and the part that South County is doing would be improved if there was greater interoperability between the CAD products and that you could simply dispatch each other's resources. That would be a positive thing. A lot of this recommendation relates to the remainder of the county that does not have a boundary drop response and does not cross boundaries as much as you do here in the South County. Station identifiers. One thing positive in the county is that the unit identifiers are unique, which allows CAD to select resources easier. Matching a home station number with the unit number helps to identify a home base for a unit. This is a minor unit issue, and it does not affect the CAD process at all. It's just an idea that would help to identify home units. We think the Santa Clara fire chiefs might want to consider this recommendation, but again, it's a minor issue. Moving into EMS, ambulances transport is provided by AMR. Palo Alto provides area for their service in the city and the area of Stanford. 5 agencies provide backup transport. 911 paramedic service and emergency transport is overseen by Santa Clara County EMS. Agreements are in place with each agency and they're very well defined. Morgan Hill is listed twice on this slide just because I like Morgan Hill. I think it's a really nice community, but in essence, they do not provide backup transport. SCFD provided by CAL FIRE does not provide transport. I think I have that wrong. Morgan Hill does provide transport. Yes. That was a back and forth with us and CAL FIRE to make sure that was accurate, but my error on that statement. EMS performance, the next particular slide. The county oversees the performance. We did not analyze or redo their analysis of response times for EMS performance. They require a 90th percentile for urban, suburban, and rural wilderness and have different times for those. An urban ALS first response for more serious calls is targeted at 7 minutes, 59 seconds, 90% of the time. Urban ALS transport for more serious calls is 11 minutes, 59 seconds, 90% of the time. There's a lot more detail available in the report, but also through the county EMS website on EMS performance. Mutual aid. This represents aid provided to others, both automatic and mutual. Countywide mutual aid agreements provided the legal means to operate in a neighbor's jurisdiction. Without that, you would have a hard time operating. The percent that's next to the actual number or the agency represents their percentage of total calls, not just the percentage of calls that might be mutual aid, but the percentage of mutual aid calls that are their total number. San Jose may have a large number of mutual aid, but it represents only 1.1%. The Morgan Hills, South County, and Gilroy, with your drop border agreement, have a larger percentage of calls. This is really best practice to drop a border and allow for that. That managing that surge in the overall system with that type of a plan is commendable. And we are recommending that later on in this, that be done more countywide. Our next piece moves into growing wildfire concerns, and I'm going to turn that over to Laura to speak to the rest of these, to a number of slides.
Good evening, everyone. As Dan said, I'm going to cover the community risk reduction or fire prevention slide, starting with probably your most significant risk, which is wildfire. And every year, CAL FIRE updates the list of the most destructive fires, and 6 Bay Area fires have made the top 20. Every community within Santa Clara County has some degree of risk and should therefore be involved in mitigation of the risk. Next slide. The county WUI's areas are non-contiguous. They're about 23% of the entire county, and the Fire Safe Council, the Countywide Fire Safe Council, as well as the other independent fire safe councils, are a huge step in addressing it. Looking at the wildfire problem from a grassroots level, and as a community, is the best way to gain fire adaptation and resilience. In 2016, their community wildfire protection plan was created, and it identifies and addresses hazards and risks related to wildfire, identifies what specifically is at risk, and a roadmap of actions. It's also key to gaining federal and state funding, which the Fire Safe Council has been very successful in gaining. Next slide. So one of the recommendations is to regularly update the CWPP. I know that there's an effort underway now with a new grant, and looking at it to ensure that all of the cities with a risk are participating. Not everybody currently has an annex in the report. And also looking at, next slide, looking at ways to have economies of scale by looking through each annex that the different cities create and finding areas of potential overlap or the ones that can be combined to get more bang for the buck, so to speak, whether it be mitigation, monitoring, or outreach efforts that can be easily be done countywide. Excuse me. Okay, next slide. The list should also prioritize the most significant risks to the county. Based on fire modeling is the best way to do it. A lot of CWPPs do contain fire modeling. The most prevalent wind direction and where the fires typically start can be used to identify the highest risks and take care of those first. Implementation should involve staff of not just the fire agencies, but the city and county OES. Have a few other recommendations related to County Office of Emergency Services, as well as hired contractors. And there is a statewide problem with workforce to find the contractors, but it is definitely being worked on. So hopefully it won't be a hindrance in this case. As far as counties who have, it's very rare to find a county that has a countywide fire safe council, so that's commendable, and also a countywide CWPP. But there are 3 other counties, Napa, Marin, and San Diego, and they have been able to, with their last update, find ways to combine projects and have one master list countywide that addresses all risks in each, regardless of jurisdiction. Next slide. In addition, we're recommending annual updates of the CWPP. Not sure if the Fire Safe Council, I would like to talk to them about how they are going to present the CWPP, if it's going to be virtual, and if that would allow every community member and every other Fire Safe Council, as well as the fire agencies, to see what is in progress, what's pending, so they can look forward to budgeting and setting aside resources to be able to mitigate those risks. Slide. We're also recommending project coordination meetings, and that includes all agencies. So the landowners and managers, the local nonprofits, and this is another way to get resources and funding to actually accomplish the work. It's always a challenge to find the workforce as well as the funding sources. Next slide. And finally, a project database that's available to the community so that people can participate. A lot of recommendations, good recommendations, come from community members and not just the fire agencies or the people that are working directly at the Fire Safe Council. But if everybody has access and can see what projects, then they can help steer it in a direction that prioritizes the highest risks. So this slide is the more traditional fire prevention services. It's a summary. There are 3 slides that have the same columns. It's just to accommodate all of the fire agencies and cities. And the first one's pretty self-explanatory, staffing. The second one is amending the California Fire Code. So state law requires that the fire code be adopted every 3 years. California adopts the international fire and building codes and asks each city to adopt them by a specific date. This year it was January 1st of 2023, and it's done every 3 years. And they also allow amendments to that fire code based on local findings. And all 15 jurisdictions in Santa Clara have adopted the fire code as required and have also adopted amendments. So the 9 fire agencies have 15 fire codes that have hopefully slight variations. In some cases, it's more significant. The Fire Marshals Association is working on consistency. Plan review and construction inspections. There are several there that use the best practice of housing, co-locating the fire and building plan review and inspection services. So it creates a one-stop shop for customers. In some cases, it is separate, but in quite a few, they're doing electronic plan review, even if it's separate. So it's much easier on the customer. Mandated and annual inspections. The mandated inspections, the state requires annual inspections of multifamily residential properties, detention facilities, and licensed residential facilities and schools. And most jurisdictions are completing those annually. Hazardous materials. This column is specifically related to the Certified Unified Program Agency, which for Santa Clara is environmental health. There are a couple fire agencies that are also participating as a CUPA, and that's Gilroy and Santa Clara City and Sunnyvale. The state law that created these consolidation of 6 hazardous materials programs also allowed cities to, if they were not going to be the Certified Unified Program Agency or CUPA, they could be a participating agency. So you'll see on there that some of them took responsibility for 1 or more of the 6 programs. Investigations, most of the jurisdictions are doing investigations. The best practice in Santa Clara County is a fire investigation task force, and participating agencies can go there for additional resources if there's a large fire, a fatality fire, or they're just short on resources for that particular shift, maybe due to a large call load. And finally, public education. It's pretty scarce, and just like in most fire agencies statewide and actually nationwide, it is difficult to have the resources necessary to educate our population in a way that changes behavior so that we are not so reliant on emergency response. But there is an effort in every jurisdiction to accomplish that. So the next 2 slides are just summarizing those same programs in each of the jurisdictions. So we can go to the next slide. So for our recommendations related to fire inspections, because not everybody is accomplishing all of their mandated inspections, it's important that the governing bodies for each of the agencies know what is being done and what's not being done. And so that's the subject of a state law that passed a couple of years ago. And every January, the fire agencies should be reporting to every governing body the status of mandated inspections. So our recommendation is that those reports go forward every year. And also the state fire marshal would like copies of the reports. They're creating a portal where it can be, the status of mandated inspections can be reported. In some cases, in the case of high-rise occupancies and detention facilities, the state will come out and complete them as the state fire marshal's office within the jurisdiction. And then they are authorized to charge the city for completing those inspections. Next slide. The plan review and construction process, in addition to the 15 different fire codes, there are a variety of different processes and locations for those processes. So there's a best practice in the hazardous materials or the CUPA field for hazardous materials that I didn't mention, but it is an excellent way to convey who's responsible and what's required for service, where to go, what the hours are, and that's the Unidocs. So for those not familiar with it, it's an online living document that's updated regularly. And so everybody, if anybody is anywhere in the county, they can find out where to go for the underground tank program, or who's responsible for the hazardous materials business plans in a particular city. So doing something similar, if the Santa Clara Fire Marshals Association did something similar to this for plan review, that would go a long ways in helping the customer identify where to go. Updates on requirements and turnaround times, all of that information is updated regularly on this web-based document. It's one of the best I've seen. Next slide. So there are some cities who don't have any information relative to fire prevention services, where to go for plan review, who to contact to get a permit. And so this was just a simple recommendation to put that links on city websites on which fire department to go to. And then for those fire agencies to also provide the checklists or guidelines that are used by staff in conducting a plan review or inspection online and available to the customer. Next slide. Fee schedules. Each city, each jurisdiction does adopt their own fee schedule, and state law says that requires the cost or the fee to not be higher than the cost of providing the service. And in many cases, the fee schedules are different, yet the people completing the work are the same people, as in the case of Central Fire Protection District. So just taking a look at those fee schedules to make sure that they meet that government code section. Another recommendation is to consider allowing Central's governing body to adopt a single fee schedule for use by their staff in all jurisdictions that they serve. Fire investigations. As I mentioned, the best practice is being utilized of a task force. However, not all of the data is stored in a manner that it can be accessed by a particular city or their fire department. And also the data quality could be higher. Sometimes it's difficult, as Dan mentioned, in writing reports. That's why the passive reports are sometimes a lot easier, but getting the details on not just what burned, but how it burned and why it burned. And those fields are in the reporting database. So doing a quality control on that data and making it available is important to ensuring that specific risks in each jurisdiction can be identified and targeted. So targeted for education programs, for if required enforcement programs, but without knowing specifically what our risks are or where they're located, it's very difficult to make a difference in having to respond. The prevention part is very difficult, and we rely mostly on mitigation. Next slide. And finally, public education. So that each city is providing data, mostly through links to different resources from the State Fire Marshal's Office. Several do have their own materials that they make up, but a best practice would be to have some consistency in the information that's used and conveyed to the public, so that the public hears a single message and it doesn't come across as a lot of noise if we're trying to send them too much information at once. To augment resources, because resources are difficult in public education programs, is working with some of the local CERT and Red Cross groups. Quite a few jurisdictions do that already, but making that more of a countywide practice would go a long ways in improving the potential for behavior change in residents and businesses. And next slide. Okay, emergency preparedness was another area that we looked at. And this slide again is just summarizing some of the findings. The Santa Clara Office of Emergency Services is the lead agency in Santa Clara County for that operational area. And each jurisdiction, each city does have their own also. And those are usually used for the day-to-day or small scale emergency. But when there are two more jurisdictions impacted, it's usually triggers the county to take lead. The County Board of Supervisors does appoint the lead of the Office of Emergency Management, and that's a best practice. What the Office of Emergency Management did with their coordination with the Central Fire Protection District is another best practice. And you can see on there too, we are, I'll get to the recommendations in a minute. Next slide. Okay, that's just completing the list. So it's either the lead agency is Santa Clara County. And you can see that some have separate Office of Emergency Management or Office of Emergency Services, and then some use their police or fire departments. So the County Office of Emergency Management they have a pretty robust emergency operations plan. It's not updated on a regular schedule. So one of our recommendations is to make sure it's updated regularly. Next slide. And in order to improve community preparedness, it's a good idea not just to do the outreach, but schedule drills or even tabletop exercises in each jurisdiction, especially when conducting the updates. And if you're getting community input, that's a good time to maybe do exercise, even if it is a paper exercise. I kind of talked about this one. There is Los Gatos and Monte Serrano join forces, as do the county and Central Fire Protection District. And it's to continue to look for opportunities to consolidate. Most of the emergencies are going to be like a wildfire emergency or an earthquake that's going to be countywide. So the more that they can start working together now, the better prepared everybody will be. Fire Safe Council representation and not just the office, but in the emergency operations plan is a good idea. They both address the wildfire risk, since the Office of Emergency Management and the plan is all risk, and we have a community wildfire protection plan in place. At least referencing it in the wildfire annex of the emergency operation plan would be a good idea, but even better would be having them work together for consistency and coordination. Next slide. So I just mentioned this one is the references, or better yet, when the updates, even if the updates could be on similar schedules, but at least work together a little bit on that one, maybe a member on each other's committee or a liaison. Next slide. Back to Dan.
Great, thank you very much. I wanted to talk a little bit about this processing of emergency calls, emergency communications system. PSAP is a public safety answering point. It's basically who picks up the 911 call. In Santa Clara County, there are 18 separate PSAPs that answer the 911 call, which is a little larger than normal for a typical county. There's 9 unique fire and EMS dispatch centers with 6 unique CADs. I'll kind of go through a little bit of how this works in the dispatch center. That flows. The CAD products are over here. We have a lot of agencies that are using Hexagon, but just because they have Hexagon product doesn't mean that the Hexagon formulation actually is connecting with each other. There's a few in the north end that have actually combined with a purchase of CAD that can virtually work together and make that work. In MDCs, this is a mobile data computer, and it allows direct connection with CAD for information flow back and forth. And an AVL is automatic vehicle location, which does require a GPS unit on the apparatus, along with a CAD that can manage the GIS mapping to make that happen. In these cases, they're with a GIS dispatching using AVL, you're dispatching by the actual location instead of by their home station, which allows a more accurate dispatch of resources as resources are moving around the area. Those are key. The processing of emergencies, I'll focus in a bit on what's happening in this area. You end up with the city of Gilroy. If you can move to the next slide. The city of Gilroy, 911 calls are answered by the city's police department, who dispatches fire and transfers the information via phone to county communication for the ambulance response. There's not a direct link to send the request. In South County, county dispatch answers the 911 call, then dispatches the ambulance and then notifies CAL FIRE by phone for a fire response. In Morgan Hill, the police department answers the 911 call and then notifies CAL FIRE via phone for the fire response, and then calls county by phone for an ambulance response. And I'll talk a little bit about in recommendations about what we can do to maybe streamline some of that. A positive piece that's initiated by the county EMS agency is that all EMS protocols, all centers are required to use the same protocols. So when you dial 911, you're going to get the same kind of question no matter which center that answers the call, which is a positive step in consistency from a community perspective. A recommendation, the first one I want to talk about is the CAD to CAD interoperability. This allows for two-way communication between systems that would allow you to potentially transfer data, maintain resource status, and could reduce transfers by phone. You can work through an aggregator and everybody can stay on the CAD product they're on today and accomplish that through an aggregation that allows the CAD products to connect and make that happen. We're recommending Silicon Valley Regional Interoperability Authority, or SVRIA, be looking at the goal of improved interoperability. That is their target. They have a JPA with service providers, including funding options, and they've had some recent success with new radios, everyone being on the same spectrum. Prior to this change, in the Santa Clara County as a whole, there were 4 separate radio bands in use. The next slide talks about the AVL dispatch of resources. We talked about the value of this already. If you can dispatch by actual location at the moment of the 911 call, you're going to get the closest resource. And each agency should work with their dispatch center along with their own technology improvements to try and make that happen. The next one is on a feasibility study. We think there's a lot of value in reducing the number of PSAPs, finding a common CAD platform for as much of fire and EMS as we could, and look into regional dispatching of the agency, or at least common connection through virtual dispatch options. Law enforcement doesn't tend to have the same need for the back and forth. And I think it's actually healthy to look at a potential fire and EMS model alone, dispatching resources, whether you have multiple regionals, but reduce the amount of back and forth that's requiring phone calls. The next parts we'll go through is the government structure alternatives that we'll turn back to Jennifer.
Thank you, Dan. So a significant component of this service review is identifying potential governmental structure alternatives to enhance efficiency of services. as mentioned in the required determinations that we covered. This content is covered in the determinations of each of the agencies, but also in the focus issues chapter towards the beginning of the report. So I highly recommend taking a look at that portion of the report if you're limited on time and don't have hours to read 600 pages. As mentioned previously on the next slide, this is a required content for a service review. Over the course of the review, several options were identified and assessed, resulting in certain recommendations. These options and recommendations are intended to provide a starting point for discussions amongst the agencies, as any changes in organization would ultimately rely on the interest of the agencies themselves and their efforts to implement. On the next slide, we covered efficiencies of contracts and joint powers authorities or agreements. Contracting for services or formation of a JPA to combine operations of two or more agencies are general joint service structures that are worth consideration for most of the agencies, as these can be tailored to the needs of the agencies involved. Both structures provide an opportunity to pool resources, to share expertise, and to optimize operations despite capacity constraints faced by an agency. It should be noted that these structure alternatives do not provide a singular solution to constraints faced by an agency, and other efforts would likely be necessary to fully address any challenges to services. On the next slide, we have a few recommendations. An example of a JPA structure that may be beneficial for member agencies is a JPA combining operations of the Mountain View, Palo Alto, Sunnyvale, Santa Clara, and Central departments due to the vicinity. While we do say combining operations, of course, there's also the opportunity to do it for specific services or functions within the fire department, such as training. While not common, there are examples of cities creating similar shared service structures, resulting in cost reductions, improved efficiencies, and enhanced effectiveness. On the next slide, a focus of this review is the areas in the county that are located outside of a local fire provider. It does not mean that they lack a fire provider. It means that they don't have an identified fire provider. Oftentimes in these areas, some agency is providing service by being dispatched to the area, although it's not within their boundaries. So we'd like to term these areas outside of a local fire provider. These areas were identified based on their location compared to their critical boundaries, such as city limits, the spheres of influence, and the urban service areas. There's a total of 33 areas that were identified that cover 539 square miles. There are several key aims to ensuring that all territory within the county lies within the boundaries of a local fire provider. These include ensuring year-round rapid and efficient response in both local responsibility areas and state responsibility areas. As the state responsibility areas are expansive, and CAL FIRE generally only staffs the station serving these areas during the fire season unless there is an Amador plan agreement in place to staff throughout the year. The process of formally identifying a local fire provider also for each of these areas allows LAFCO to process and validate the ability of the agency to provide the necessary services, considering factors such as capacity and financial ability. By formally identifying the appropriate provider to the area, it streamlines the dispatch service to ensure rapid response, which is particularly critical in areas in need of emergency medical services and areas with structures and residents in the wildland urban interface areas. Also, by identifying a provider for the areas, it ensures constituents have a means to address the agency that is protecting them, so enhancing accountability. And finally, these areas are likely already receiving services, as I mentioned, by neighboring providers, but the services are provided without any kind of revenue source to recoup those costs. So including the areas in a provider's boundaries would allow them to recoup a portion of those costs at least. Okay, on the next slide, you'll see a map of the areas that were identified and broken down by those critical boundaries that were mentioned. It's a little zoomed out and hard to see the detail on the screen, I'm sure. So I just refer to that section in the report at the beginning regarding the government structure alternatives. We'll have a good quality map and also some insets so that you can see a little more detail as to where these areas are. There's also an expansive table in the report with details on each of the areas regarding items like land use, whether it's located in a local responsibility area or state responsibility area. The degree of demand within the area, for example, are there structures or are there recreational activities requiring emergency medical services? Whether the area is categorized as wildland urban interface, a list of the feasible options for incorporating the area into a local fire provider, and then the recommended option. So on the next slide, are some recommendations regarding these areas. In many cases, there's a common recommended service structure that is, in many instances, the only feasible option given the location of those critical boundaries that I referenced previously that greatly limit the available options, such as the location of the urban service area. This structure involves annexation by an adjacent fire protection district and then contracting for services with an appropriate provider, which in many cases is a city fire department. For example, areas 1 through 6 are recommended to be annexed into Central and then contract with either the city of Milpitas or San Jose for services as already occurs within Central's bounds in the area through the Zone 1 agreement. A similar service structure is proposed for areas adjacent to South County Fire and Los Altos Hills County Fire, and is applicable to areas 7, 9 through 20, and 22 through 25. On the next slide are some other recommendations with regard to these areas. A few of the areas are already exist within the sphere of influence for Los Altos Hills County Fire and South County Fire, and promoting annexation of those areas that are already within their sphere would be a good tool for ensuring that the areas are within a local fire provider. For Area 8, which is the expansive area to the east of the urban core, the area is entirely state responsibility area and is served by CAL FIRE during the fire season. Historically, there was an Amador Plan agreement in effect in the area where CAL FIRE provided year-round staffing. This was funded by the county. Re-implementing the Amador Plan would enhance public safety year-round in this area. There are no other feasible options for extending services by another adjacent agency in that area. There are 2 unique areas that are excluded from Palo Alto Fire Department's contract for services to Stanford University. These areas are 2 elementary schools, one of which is entirely surrounded by the Stanford campus and the other surrounded on 3 sides by Stanford campus. While there is no precedent for this, it's recommended that the city of Palo Alto come to an agreement with the Palo Alto Unified School District regarding those school properties to ensure that services are provided when necessary in an emergency situation. The service structures for areas 28 through 33 is recommended to remain unchanged given minimal demand. There's no or few structures. There's extremely limited financing potential, and there's expansive state responsibility area receiving necessary services from CAL FIRE and a lack of any other feasible options. Okay, on the next slide. County parks compose all or portions of areas 9, 17 through 20, and 22 through 23, which are tax exempt and provide no revenue to service providers, although there's certainly a demand for services in those areas with recreational users. State parks and open space also make up quite a bit of the other areas, such as the Henry W. Coe State Park and Area 10. These areas are tax exempt and provide no revenue. As I mentioned, there's also sizable open space properties owned by Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District, and that's located in many of the rural areas outside of the urban core, portions of which are in areas 19 through 23. Public Resources Code requires that open space districts be primarily responsible for the prevention and suppression of all fires on any lands in its possession or control. To meet this responsibility, Mid-Pen actively enacts fire prevention, preparation, and response services and relies on CAL FIRE for fire protection services, as most of its lands lie in the state responsibility area. However, in certain cases, there's stations of other providers are closer and may provide faster response than CAL FIRE, particularly during the off-season when CAL FIRE stations are not staffed. If one of the adjacent providers chooses not to annex the areas in question, it may be beneficial for Mid-Pen to enter into an agreement or other desired structure with an appropriate service provider. The next slide, outside of these areas that are outside of a local fire provider, there were some other governmental structure options that were identified, one of which is the possibility for Santa Clara County to become a contract county by providing contract services to the state. That would be filling the services that would otherwise be provided by CAL FIRE for reimbursement. This option has been considered in the past with no steps taken beyond initial discussion. The benefits of this option may be enhancing revenues for local providers, offering services beyond CAL FIRE's obligations to include structural fire protection and emergency medical response, particularly in the areas we previously discussed. And also staffing can be extended to year-round at remote facilities if needed. Inclusion of Alameda and Contra Costa in the restructuring would create a more cohesive fire service structure in the Bay Area and likely enhance bargaining power with the state. On the next slide, the fire districts were a focus of the governance structure alternatives to inform the recommendations for each district's sphere of influence that are found in the report. Options were based on service efficiency, cost effectiveness, and viability as established in the criteria for review. So first we have Central was identified as having reasonable economies of scale that allow for greater efficiency and effectiveness. So there were few governance structure alternatives available for the district. However, it does face certain staffing constraints in particular divisions, indicating that there's still the potential for value added from a shared services structure, possibly a JPA with the cities that were mentioned previously. There's also the areas that were mentioned, several areas that are currently outside of a local fire provider, for which Central is the best position to annex to enhance public safety services. On the next slide is Los Altos Hills County Fire District. As has been identified in the past, there's the option for Central to annex the territory with Los Altos Hills County boundaries and dissolution of the district to streamline the governance structure, as Central presently provides services within Los Altos Hills County. However, the district augments services within its boundaries and has a strong financial position and does not impact logical boundaries of other providers. So there does not appear to be an impetus to pursue reorganization right now of the district. Similar to Central, it is also best positioned to annex the territories that are adjacent to it in order to ensure that all areas are within an identified local fire provider. The next slide is Saratoga Fire District. As has been identified in the past, there's the option for Central also to annex the territory within Saratoga's boundaries and dissolution of the district to streamline services and governance structure. Central presently provides services within Saratoga. This review affirms that there are redundancies in the current service structure that could be more efficient with just one fire district serving the area. And then finally, we have South County Fire. The southern region of Santa Clara is served by South County and the cities of Gilroy and Morgan Hill. These agencies each play an integral part in each other's services. The three agencies have practiced significant collaboration, planning, and resource sharing. And there's certainly further opportunities to better share and leverage resources. And those include, on the next page, the possibility of the agencies entering into an MOU toward long-term cooperative fire services, establishing perhaps a joint strategic planning team. Gilroy could contract with CAL FIRE, thus making the region served by a single entity for consistency and cohesiveness of response and ease of communication, potentially enhancing negotiation powers with CAL FIRE also. In the long term, the agencies may wish to consider annexation of Morgan Hill and Gilroy Fire Services into South County to fully maximize efficiencies and effectiveness. And on the next slide, as mentioned, there's this possibility for South County to annex these adjacent territories that lack a fire provider. While South County is working to address projected financial shortfalls over the next 5 years, it does remain the only viable option for taking on services in 6 areas. That would be areas 9 through 14. And I'll pass it back to you, Dan, now for the next slide.
Thanks. We're pretty much right on time. I wanted to just talk about the full report. This is a large and comprehensive report, over 600 pages. We simply focused on the overview during this time. The agencies have had a chance to look at the profiles, but this report's the first time people have seen some of our determinations, our analysis, our recommendations. LAPCO is now taking comments formally, and please take time to consider, what we've identified here in the report. There's a lot of moving parts in this county. There's a lot of people that are very close to certain areas and not close necessarily to like the north area for here. We want to see you take time to review, comment, and even challenge some of the suggestions that we've made. We want to hear this. We want to produce a tool that provides some value for the communities to make that fit. And it's important by the end of this month, we have as an accurate report as possible with the best feasible options that we can present. It doesn't mean there won't still be some things in the report that maybe are not feasible today, but still could demonstrate best practice. We may want to still identify those options. And in the end, the actual considerations really become mostly up to local agencies, which will require a focus on what's best for the community, and ability to maintain and enhance the positive relationships that are available today between the service providers, the entities, the fire chiefs. Those are really important pieces that we subscribe to for this full report. Lastly, I'd like to thank the group of people here, the LAFCO commissioners, the TAC group that was formed, the LAFCO staff, the district elected officials and staff. And especially I want to take the fire chiefs and their staff that responded over and over again, back and forth. There was a lot of really good people that I've had a chance to work with in these fire departments that had just as much interest in making sure we had the right information. And a special thanks to the county planning office for preparing the maps that were included in this report. With that, I'll turn it back to LAFCO and Nalima for follow-up questions.